So now that we are recording, I think all of our presenters for the first presentation are on board. So like I said, my name is Miranda. I'm actually going to be your moderator for this session. So a little repetitive housekeeping, as we've all heard this a million times, I'm sure. Please make sure that you remain muted once the presentation begins, unless, they're asking for questions, and feel free to put any questions in the chat box as well. We also ask that you please keep your cameras on if possible during the presentation. And please message me if you need to turn your cameras off or leave for an extended period of time, 10 minutes plus. If you're having technical difficulties, please message us so that we can hopefully get you situated as quickly as possible. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brent Williams. He's a professor in the Counseling Education and Supervision program at the University of Arkansas. So go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. I am Brent Williams. I am with the University of Arkansas. Today we'll be presenting on case management using promised qualitative data to inform best practices. As most of you know, and we'll get much more into this as we move forward. Promise was a project that we did. It's been over for a couple of years, but like a lot of projects, we're still processing through the data. So if we go into the next slide, please. As I said, I am Brent Williams. This is an outline of today's presentation, and I'll let the rest of my co-presenters introduce themselves to you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Crawford. I am a second-year doctoral student at the University of Arkansas, and I'm excited to be here today and talk to you about our project.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Hall. I am a certified rehab counselor and also a third-year doc student at the U of A. I see a lot of familiar faces. Hello. Looking forward to sharing this information with you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mary Keith. I'm starting my third year in the doctoral program at the University of Arkansas in the Counselor Education and Supervision Department. I also serve as a graduate assistant in the department, and I'm excited to be here this morning and want to welcome each of you.
Before Rachel begins with the learning objectives, just want to say, and this is always this kind of a housekeeping thing, we'll do this morning, that if anybody has questions throughout the presentation, don't feel like you have to wait to the end of the presentation. None of what we're saying is so crucial or time sensitive that you have to wait to the end. So if you have a question, either whether in the chat or in person, just let us know and we'll answer it. Rachel, if you would, you may begin.
All right. So we have 4 learning objectives for today, things we'll hope you'll get out of this. Our first one is that attendees will develop an understanding of current best practices in case management and VR service environments. These are things I think a lot of you are really familiar with, but just kind of go over those and look at those. The next one is attendees will develop an understanding of how qualitative analysis can be used to establish best practices in case management and VR service environments. So we're really looking at the experiences that people had during Promise, and we hope that those will be beneficial to you in your practice. Our third objective, attendees will incorporate Arkansas Promise participants and stakeholders' own account of what contributed to successful outcomes into the field's current understanding of case management best practices. So taking those perspectives and applying them. And the last, attendees will strategize how to incorporate Arkansas Promise participants and stakeholders' own accounts of what contributed to successful outcomes into case management. So we really hope that this is usable, implementable material for you in the future. So current best practices. Current best practices include using counseling. Both psychological and vocational are identified as being necessary. We have to be able to relate to our consumers as people. And so the psychological can really come in handy with that. Skills training, so making sure that our consumers have the skills that they need to do the tasks and the jobs that we want them to, and then supported employment. So when they need extra help, that we're able to provide that. In actual practice, we know that it doesn't always work the way that we want it to. We know that smaller caseloads are really better for the consumers and for the case managers, but with the shortage of rehabilitation counselors, that's often not the case. Unfortunately, there's a lot more consumers than there are providers sometimes. Case management remains a siloed service, so there's not a lot that we can necessarily do sometimes with Social Security or with some of the other services that our consumers need. So the separation is not always helpful. Funding continues to decline, as it does with a lot of services. And then availability of job positions often doesn't allow for consumer choice in where they're placed. So consumers may end up placed in positions that they don't really have an interest in. So sometimes it's harder to get buy-in for what they want and for them to actively participate in that work experience. The current gaps in case management, Anthony and Ms. Og point out that rehabilitation counseling could benefit from use of evidence-based mental health skills. And they really talk about a lot of different skills, but the main one that they point out is to really be able to use that relationship part, the counseling relationship, to better get buy-in. But unfortunately, a lot of times there's time restraints and issues really being able to do that the way that we would like to. Case management really focuses on the consumer as an individual, and sometimes forgets that they're part of a family system, part of different systems, and that those can provide benefits and also barriers sometimes. So it's a necessary thing, but it also can provide its own set of trouble. And then agency separation and rigid business practices make it hard for case managers to fluidly respond to the needs of their consumers. So the fact that things are siloed, the fact that everybody is separate and has certain procedures to follow can really be prohibitive sometimes.
Okay, so I want to begin with talking a little bit about exactly what Promise was. And although I know many of you are probably familiar with the Promise Grant, I want to make sure that everyone in the room, or in the Zoom, I should say, knows exactly what we're talking about when we mention Promise. So Promise, which stands for Promoting the Readiness of Minors in Supplemental Security Income, was one of 6 projects funded nationally. The Arkansas Promise Model Demonstration Project was a $32.4 million 5-year grant awarded by the U.S. Department of Education to the University of Arkansas College of Education and Health Professions and the Arkansas Department of Education. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that the Arkansas Promise Grant was not simply created out of thin air. The Promise Grant was an attempt to fix our, what do we do with all this transition money issue? And by that, I mean that the federal government had been giving states, including Arkansas, money specifically to support adolescents with disabilities and their transition from high school to early adulthood. What we found out is that that money was being sent back to the federal government every year. Enter Arkansas Promise. The 5-year project began in 2013. Oh, go back one slide, please. Thank you. The 5-year project began in 2013 and ended in the fall of 2018. There was a 1-year extension in which there were more funds given to Promise in order to wrap up all of the services that had been put into place and to add supports for adolescents with disabilities and their families. Basically, the Promise Grant was designed to improve the education and employment outcomes of youth with disabilities, as well as reduce their reliance on public benefits in the long term. The evaluation of the Promise Grant will continue until 2023, which is an additional 5 years, and the youth that were participants in the Promise Grant will be followed. Data will be gathered about those participants so that we can analyze the long-term effects of the Promise Grant. Next slide, please. So now I want to share some of the things that we found that worked really well for the Promise Grant and the youth and families that we served. And this information was gathered from those participants and their families. So we had core services, which included paid work experiences and supplemental education for the entire family. We also had intensive case management, which was vital to the Promise program. And by intensive case management, I mean that our connectors, which are our case managers or were our case managers, worked from a holistic approach with each unique family. Connectors were often the first person to help families remove barriers to services. Youth were seen or contacted every 7 to 10 days. Connectors would meet families and youth wherever they were, at their homes, at the library, in the parking lot of the school. We made meetings happen. If a family needed money to buy a part to fix their car so that they could get their youth to school or to trainings or to work, then Arkansas Promise and Connectors would help with those things. Sometimes we paid utilities because you can't get homework done, you can't get ready for work in the dark. And sometimes you have to help families with things like that. Connectors took youth shopping for school clothes, they arranged college tours. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Whatever a family needed in order to be successful was done. These small things really add up to make a situation very difficult for youth and families. And the leadership and Connectors with Promise understood that those small things can discourage a family. So they did all they could to help. We had some really, really interesting requests. I bet Mary has a few stories she could share with you about some of the things that she had to deal with. We found that integrated resource teams worked really well for Promise participants. So we had Connectors, we had transition specialists through Arkansas Rehab Services, we had job coaches, we had benefits counselors, all working together to make sure that every support that we could think of would be provided for those youth and the families. Next slide, please. Oh, this is my slide. Sorry about that. So supplemental education was a huge part of the Promise project. We found that families were really lacking the knowledge of resources that were available in order to best help their youth. And we thought that it would probably be a really good idea to offer various opportunities for supplemental education. So in all 25 counties, families were offered the opportunity to come together with Promise staff and trainers and learn things that like financial literacy or nutrition. I mean, just a long list of education there. There were a lot of things covered in those sessions. There were things that applied to the whole family. There were things that were just for the parents. There were things that were just for the youth. And as families communicated what they wanted to learn about or where the gaps in their knowledge was, Promise would do its best to fill those gaps and bring in trainers and other information and connect them to resources. We also found that early intervention activities were very helpful for our youth and families. Youth did interest and career assessments with their transition specialists and their Connectors or case managers. What we know from the research and from our clients is that youth with disabilities are not given the same opportunities to explore their interests as far as career goals like their peers are. Youth with disabilities start work at a much later age than their peers. And often what's missing for our kids with disabilities are the opportunities to really explore what they like and, more importantly, what they don't like. We also did a lot of soft skills training. We wanted to make sure that once we placed youth on a job site, that they would have some of that base knowledge that we need to be successful in a work environment. I think we can all remember our very first job. I don't know about y'all, but there are certainly things I did when I was 16 or 18 that I definitely do not do now, especially when it comes to dealing with people in positions of authority, time management, you know, even just how to read your paycheck. Like where is all my money going? You know, those are things that we need to make sure that we're covering with our youth when they go to work. And that was missing for our kids. So I really wanted to end and just say that I really think that what our case managers or our Connectors did were really like the glue that held, you know, our teams together because they dealt with our youth the most. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Mary.
Thanks, Andrea. So this portion of the presentation is going to do an overview about the data collection process and what the responses have been found from participants and our stakeholders. So now that Daria has done a wonderful job of helping to establish the important programmatic background details about Promise, I like to speak about the process of data collecting and processing. To research findings of a large project like Promise, one approach that can be used is to use focus groups. And so that's what our project did, to collect the qualitative data to analyze for this research. So the purpose of a focus group is to explore prominent themes and patterns to better understand an experience. And in this particular case, we're wanting to know and better understand the experience of Promise families, Promise participants, as well as our stakeholders, which consisted of community partners and agencies. So in the case of Promise, focus groups were used to better understand the experience of how things worked within our project, and what we could have done or would have done differently. So to start, representatives from each service area were invited to participate. Representatives that accepted the call of invitation completed consent forms, so giving us permission and accepting responsibility of participation, and attended the focus group that was designated for their respective region. The service area of Promise, I know Andrea shared that there's 25 counties. So of the 25 counties, those were then designated into 5 prominent regions in Arkansas. Those regions included Northwest, Eastern, Central, Pulaski, and Southern. In total, leadership completed 10 participant focus groups, which consisted of participants and their families, and 10 partner/agency focus groups, which consisted of those community agencies, partners, stakeholders that provided and collaborated with the project. Each interview was video and audio recorded and facilitated by the same team of interviewers for consistency, and lasted for approximately 1 to 2 hours. And so from there, each focus group was asked the same questions. We have to be repetitive and consistent with what we do in qualitative research. So they were asked the same questions. For our Promise participants and family members, we wanted to know what Promise services were most helpful or productive to reach goals. And what we asked families were just that, what services were most helpful to reach goals. We were also interested to know what Promise services were most helpful or least helpful. We also wanted to know what kind of barriers families had to overcome to engage or to participate in a program like Promise. We also wanted to know what accomplishments were achieved. And lastly, what made Promise different from other programs? Next slide, please. So the same method was used for our stakeholders, or again, classifying our partner agencies and community partners. What we wanted to know from their experience was systematically, what collaboration worked best, what didn't work so well. Again, we took the same approach as with the families of providing the same questions, going through and interviewing everyone the exact same. What we wanted to know in scope of Promise was how participant development impacted, education, future employment, and community independence. We wanted to know what kinds of resources and services were needed and maybe not provided. We also wanted to know what may have caused difficulty for agencies to collaborate with Promise and Promise services, as well as using the interest-based placement approach, any barriers or concerns with that approach. We also wanted to know from our partner agencies to what extent this approach facilitated future employment. And lastly, given that Promise is a model demonstration project or was a model demonstration project, we wanted to know what changes partner agencies would make to similar programming. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we have pages upon pages of, or actually audio recordings and video recordings, we now have the process of transcribing. And so what this process looked like is that from these interviews, transcripts were transcribed and the data was analyzed. From the pages and pages of transcribed data, a team of researchers began to analyze the participant responses. The researchers, AKA graduate assistants in the department, going through and working page by page with this. So from the responses, and again, emphasizing that these responses are coming directly from participants, participant families, our partner agencies, community partners, that from those responses, we're working to look for those themes and patterns. And so from the responses, we were able to develop domains. And from those domains, they're grouping identifiable topics that keep coming up from the responses that were offered. And then from the process of collecting the domains or identifying the domains, we began to abstract and develop core ideas. So from our focus groups with our families and participants, we were able to establish 4 emergent themes across their participation or experience with Arkansas Promise. Those 4 themes include relationships, personal growth, financial assistance, and holistic approach. From our focus groups with our community partners and agencies, the 4 emergent themes that were identified include preparing youth for employment, hiring individuals with disabilities, families navigating community resources, and agency and community partnerships. So to take a little bit deeper dive of what this means as far as those 4 emergent themes from our participants and families, this is what we know and understand from the responses, is that emphasis on and facilitation of personal growth, personal relationships, that was increasing confidence, that was being able to foster and develop strong relationships. You think about the many connections they had with their case managers, which in our program were called connectors. They have the relationships with transition specialists. They're working or being connected to various partner agencies and their staff members and their case managers. They're bonding with peers because we have the supplemental education program that's going on. So there's opportunity for them to bond with others in their community. They're developing friendships and spending time with others. So this had a significant impact on participants and their families. The emphasis in facilitation of personal growth. So in this area, they're increasing confidence and self-esteem. They were able to have opportunity of establishing and growing in individuality and personal responsibility. Some of those things that Andrea mentioned previously with those soft skills, have an opportunity to gain exposure to work. Participants experienced opportunities to expand on ways to cultivate a stronger connection to their community, as well as understanding and experiencing independence. The financial assistance addressing needs. This was a big ticket item for our program. And yes, there's a lot of different ways that we were able, and very fortunately able, to use the case management funds to support our participants. The financial assistance, so Promise, we established it as a tool for our connectors. So Promise utilized case management funds to assist families in ways to remove barriers. For example, the gas money to get to work, funds for a car battery, money for work attire. The financial assistance notably affected participants and supported program engagement. Lastly, with the holistic approach involving families' well-being and long-term aspirations. The holistic approach, so with Promise, we recruited youth on SSI, but the program served the entire family. This approach widened the scope of how to implement and offer services to youth with disabilities and their families to better support self-sufficiency. Promise valued the influence from of families and strive to include the needs of all people living in the home with the youth. This approach was significant in impacting the perspective of Promise participants and families, because it's not just one person receiving services, but everyone in the home. For example, the case management funds often help to support not only the youth, but the parent or guardian. There are things that we were able to assist with that, again, help to emphasize the availability of that this program is different, as well as helping families to address and assist with any barriers they were experiencing. Next slide, please. Ooh, I don't know what that looks like. Okay, so the analysis of the data from our stakeholders, and in this case, the partner agencies and community partners. So the emphasis on and development of growth of youth for employment. So this was a big thing for that particular emergent theme, is that the data analysis of the partner agency interviews brought forth those 4 emergent themes that we mentioned previously. Preparing youth for employment. So the importance of preparing youth to work, providing those work skills that were mentioned, the soft skills, and coordinating necessary supports were greatly valued. The process of that, previously mentioned, you heard connectors, you heard transition specialists, you heard job coaches, all of these services are being coordinated, not just with Promise, but with our partner agencies as well. So the emphasis of providing a program that worked to support the growth of the youth for the purpose of finding employment, finding career interest, and having them be successful. The emphasis on and development of growth of employers hiring individuals with disabilities. So hiring individuals with disabilities, recruitment was key. Recruiting community employers and cultivating those relationships and providing training support was essential. Families that were going through the process, this is something new to them. It was something new to employers oftentimes. And so providing not only the training, but the support to ensure that the relationship was there, the understanding was there, and the access to necessary supports was there. Enhanced exposure to opportunities and resources for families navigating community resources. So this was a big thing too, of that, previously we mentioned that, for many of us, we don't have a lot of time. We have large caseloads. The understanding and know how to access or know what's available in the community, that's difficult to kind of coordinate and navigate all together. So for the theme that emerged here was that families are oftentimes accessing more than one resource when they come to another partner agency or community partner. And so it's important that that families, that we empathetically understand the complexity of the application process that families may be experiencing or going through, and signaling, or maybe interjecting opportunities for referrals or coordinating and collaborating with referral resources to help to strengthen the family's self-sufficiency. Lastly, the opportunity to collaborate with partner and community agencies strengthened familiarity of services and encouraged future planning initiatives. So this was something that came through of that. This was an opportunity, or a foundational opportunity that many of the agencies, community partners, we were bringing together school districts and state agencies and community partners all together to collaborate and focus on the development of youth for work. And so those partnerships, that familiarity of who this person is or what this community resource does, help to enable future planning initiatives. Next slide, please. So with all of this, right, we had a lot of good things that came about from Promise, but with everything, now that we know what worked well, we can talk about what did not work so well. So let's see here. We had participants and families identified the process of navigating Social Security to be difficult. The challenge of enacting rarely used work incentives for youth and submitting or notifying required paperwork to local offices proved to be problematic. That was one of the emergent themes that came through from what did not work so well. In addition, talking about transportation. So the lack of sufficient resources, it created barriers and hindered access for a lot of our families to participate. That was one of the things within our program with Promise, that we were having to coordinate, large transportation needs for families to participate, given the fact that the state of Arkansas, we do not have a very accessible source of public transportation for a lot of our communities. So that really came through and magnified that deficit. Communication. So communication in a large project like this, like I will emphasize again, it's a model demonstration project. We had approaches that we were implementing that in many ways probably challenged and encouraged us to do things differently than what they had been done before. And with that, given the amount of people involved, there were areas of miscommunication, both within the program and both between our partner, community partners and state agencies, and collaborating and getting things together. Yes, we had issues with miscommunication, understanding different roles and ways of how this was going to take place. So there were those results as well that did not work so great for the project. Next up, please. What participants and stakeholders, what our partner agencies and community partners shared that did not work so well, areas of parental buy-in and responsibility. So this was interesting because, within our age group that we're servicing, you had a lot more parental involvement as far as communication, responsibility of contacting parents, contacting participants. And so there's a lot more traffic that was happening, a lot more communication traffic. And so the feedback was that because of the more interaction that was taking place and parents having access to, these resources, these case managers, that there is just a lot of challenges associated with getting parents to buy into the program, parents to understand the responsibility of participation and things that go along with that. The other area that came through was the consistency from job coaches. So our participants, if they were in need of having a job coach, we provided a job coach. This happened in very much of a sort of mass production, because at the time we did not have a lot of trained or available job coaches to provide the necessary supports that were needed. So there was Emergent Themes coming through, talking about the preparation, the training, and the consistency of the available job coaching support. The next area was employer training, very similar to the fact that this is new, not necessarily a new concept, but what we're doing is that we're recruiting a lot more employers because we were servicing over 1,000 youth in the state of Arkansas at the time. So we needed a lot more employers that had previously may not have been aware of the types of supports, were given the necessary training to be prepared to hire a youth with a disability. So that came through, and that the preparation and understanding of supports and resources for individuals with disabilities was key, and that was area that we wanted to improve upon as well. Lastly, I kind of touched on this earlier, but the communication coordination of roles. Again, you have, a lot of people working together simultaneously, and between emails and phone calls and text messages, we know things can change very quickly, especially in a work environment with the youth. You get a phone call and then an email and then a text message, and then, maybe a face-to-face visit. That there's a lot of communication that was taking place. And so with that, there were issues with miscommunication, clarity, direction that were having to be addressed and worked through, very quickly. So those are the areas that just did not work as well. Next slide, please.
That's me.
Yes. Yes. So I will hand it over to Dr. Williams at this time to carry over into the best practices for case management.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I don't see myself. Can everyone see me? All right. So one of the comments that we've gotten repeatedly since Promise ended was, well, if you found out what worked, why didn't this just magically cascade down through Rehabilitation Services Administration, Social Security Administration, and Department of Ed, and be immediately installed in voc rehab agencies across the nation? I know we're supposed to tread lightly on such matters here, but I'm old, and I actually take great pride that I've been banned from 3 previous chancellor's offices because I kind of say what happened. The Betsy DeVos Department of Education more or less had contempt for people with disabilities. And so we are hoping now with the new administration that a lot of the findings from Promise will in fact go ahead and find their way into VR service provision. Change is difficult, and what we're going to talk a lot about here is that in the absence of, in some cases, as I didn't allude, as I outright stated, that sometimes there is resistance, but then sometimes intentional with forethought, purpose, and intent, but then also the ingrained methods of how we do things get entrenched in policy and procedure. And it's hard to change course. As they say, if you're the captain of an oil tanker and you go to move the wheel and you turn the wheel, that ship doesn't spin on a dime. You wait half a day and the ship begins to turn. Most social services respond in the same way. That said, what we did learn, what we came to understand, does have real practical implications for how case management can be done, particularly in VR services. One of the things we want to get to, and Mary had alluded to this, and I just kind of want to break into this, is the holistic familial approach. I'm 57. One of the things in which I was trained, I actually graduated with my master's degree in 1994. And I think, to be quite honest, in those days, rehabilitation counseling had something of an inferiority complex. And we wanted to make sure that we were taken seriously as counselors, and that our profession was a real profession, and that we were doing real work, and that professionalism was in fact a very ingrained part of how we were to interact with each other, how we interact with our clients. And I am in no means advocating for a distancing from professionalism. What I'm saying is, and this to give you a little bit of the insight, you heard Mary talk, you heard Drea talk a little bit. In fact, you heard Rachel talk about how about the relationships. One of the things that we know, and this is from Promise, but to give you an idea about why relationships are important, is for folks in Promise, and this is true across many demographic areas. Many times the Social Security check was the household's primary source of income. So that youth, that adolescence, that person's Social Security check was the household's check. And then, in fact, this was true roughly 72% of the time in Promise. Roughly 65, maybe 63%, if I'm recollecting this correctly, of recipients who were on Social Security were second generation, and into the upper 40s and 50s were third generation. So you're asking people to not just change a belief system, change an idea, and you're not asking a simple individual to reevaluate who they are, their place in the culture, which is an incredibly big ask to ask of anyone. You're asking a family culture. You're asking a system of functioning belief that is generational. So if we think that as rehab counselors, as we go to approach someone and say, hey, I want you to make this change. What you're basically asking them to do is change their familial structure and change generational learning. And if you think you're going to accomplish changing familial structures and generational learning with, how are you today, Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, I'd like you to do this. This is a very rational reason for why I think you should make this tremendous change that is 180 degrees different from everything you've known, your family known. In fact, everything your family's done for 2 or 3 generations. Well, no, that's not how that works. And so it really is about relationships. It really is about understanding that a holistic approach means you have to care. And you do. You need to know the parents' names. You need to know the siblings' names. You need to know what their parents did for work, or did they work? You need to know what generationally that family did. And you said, well, gee, I've got this enormous caseload. And having that much depth of knowledge about per client is an onerous task. Yeah, I don't know what to say. Yeah, it is. It is. But quite frankly, that's what we're coming up against. Individuals don't exist in a vacuum. Individuals don't exist in absence of connections with other people, and individuals don't exist in absence of traditions. So when we say facilitate relationships, that's what we're talking about. It's understanding the dynamics of that familial and generational system. In the absence of understanding that, it's going to be really, really difficult to make change. And that goes part and parcel with facilitating growth and development. One of the things that struck us repeatedly, as you all know, I'm a professor. And I have a daughter who just recently graduated from college. She did quite nicely, did well. And one of the things that she consistently got praised for in college was her writing ability. She grew up in a household where I was always proofreading dissertations at night or trying to hammer out an article. And she would want to be curious to do it. And sometimes I would stick things under her nose, my wife's nose, and say, what the hell do you make of this paragraph? Can you help me with this? Her understanding, most of our understandings, most of the things that any of us do really, really well, we learn to do at our kitchen tables. Either we learned, as Mary said, we wanted to do it, or we learned that we didn't want to do it. You don't have aspirations for those things of which you are in complete ignorance. And so oftentimes, I've used this example many times, and you'll have to bear with me for hearing it again, but it does bear repeating. There are tribes of people of Mongolian and Inuit ethnicity that live near the Arctic Circle in Mongolia, and their entire diet is reindeer meat. That's all they eat. They boil the bones for soup, they eat the flesh. That's what they do, is reindeer meat. And if you go to one of these folks that's entire diet for generations, that's all their family's ever eaten, is reindeer meat, you go, hey, do you like dark chocolate or do you like milk chocolate? They're just gonna look at you funny because the question doesn't make any sense. No one's ever had any chocolate before. They've never been educated on chocolate. No one in their family, no one they've ever heard of has ever eaten chocolate. And so making an informed decision about whether they like dark chocolate or milk chocolate is a non sequitur. So when we talk about growth and development, many times we're asking people, and I think it is absolutely crucial. It is impossible to overstate how incredibly critically important it is to have people's interests and desires play a part in the trajectory of their lives. But to expect people to engage in growth and development in the absence of information is also very, very problematic. And I think that's one of the biggest disconnects that we saw is you can't ask someone to do away with the system that they've always known, with generation or familial, what they've always had, and make a decision on something they've never experienced. Or even worse, ask them to do something, and sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 3. I learned it as 3. I think there's 4 now. But the 3 F's: food, filth, and flowers. You know, one of the things that we did very, very stringently, and we tried to avoid and promise when at all possible, is having someone deep frying or scrubbing toilets, food, filter, flowers, the things we typically give people that are unskilled, particularly people with disabilities. And I understand that, particularly with COVID, particularly within the last 22 months, and Mary highlighted this, the opportunities have become fewer and further apart. What I'm saying, though, is in spite of all the reality on the ground of economic implications, you can't make decisions in the absence of information. You can't be asked to give up a generational familiar system in order to exchange it for something that you already know you don't like. As all of you know, whether it's going and ARS or Social Security, I believe those are actually good agencies formed, manned by good people who try to do good services. I'm not disparaging at all, but let's be quite frank here. Applying for social services in our culture, not for any one person or any one agency, is tantamount to hazing. The exchange that we offer people in our society and our culture is, okay, if we'd agree to help you, if as a culture and society we agree to give you a heads up, a hand up, agree to give you and provide some resources, the punishment is it's going to be arduous, it's going to take a long time to do, you're going to be disrespected and otherwise looked down upon for procuring the very service that you're asking for. And like I said, I don't think that's written into policy and procedure in any place. But as a culture and society, let's be frank, that's a large part of what we do. And so to ask people to do something that doesn't interest them, to ask them to make a decision based on no information, to ask them to just basically throw out generation and familial systems, that's not going to happen without relationships. All of this holistic approach is being cognizant of all of these factors. That's where, when you say availability of community resources, as you heard us say, you know, one of the things that in our master's programs we've often taught, and I've had to revise it as of late, is that we know that jobs. We always say that jobs are won or lost not during the interview, or not actually during the completion of the task. Jobs are won or lost usually in the break room, and how well you interface and you interact and you mesh with those in the work environment. This is where the emphasis on soft skills comes from. This is where any of those things. And once again, if someone didn't learn it at their dinner table, it's going to be a rude awakening later on. What we also found is that in addition to the soft skills, it's not having money for lunch. It's not having gas to get to work. Is that most of the impingements on successful, not just getting the placement, retainment of employment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the difference between placement and some sort of career trajectory, is availability of community resources. Hungry people who sleep in apartments with the lights out and the heat off, people who don't have sufficient clothes or shoes, people who don't have transportation. Those are the things. And once again, am I wholly and completely cognizant that as a case manager, the ability to unilaterally solve all these problems is beyond anyone's ability. Yes, I get it. I get it. I get it. What I'm here today is to simply, I guess, remind you of what you already know, is the job placement part, the training beforehand, the placement, the follow-up a few weeks later to see how it's going. Rarely are those the things that's going to keep a successful replacement, a successful placement from being retainment, from being some sort of ongoing success. What's going to be the thing that's more frequent than not, the snag that prevents success, is the lack of utilization of community resources. That's the thing. Yeah. Now, yes, if you put them if you have them scrubbing toilets and you didn't give them any insight into the job, you didn't provide them with any other additional things, you ignored their interest or desire, yeah, you're probably not going to have a successful completion. But most of the time, it's the periphery. It's the ancillary services that doesn't make a placement stick and doesn't result in a successful outcome. The other thing here that we want to talk about as far as how this looks like is facilitated relationships in education employers. I'm like to give a few examples of this. We had some very successful placements through HARPS. And everyone in this room, like I said, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm just reminding you, especially in these economic times, that most of the times when we had issues with employers, it wasn't prejudice or bigotry or some overt disparaging of folks with disabilities. It was ignorance. In both in constructing the placement and the ongoing success. And two examples to kind of show you this. We're very successful working with HARPS. HARPS was actually very HARPS grocers were actually very good for Promise to work with. And everybody's familiar with job carving, right? We all know what job carving is. But one of the things that we had to do was figure out how to get employers to do job carving and to figure out how employers to understand that not everybody's going to match a job title and not everybody is going to match the specific things you wanted. I just looked down and saw that I'm butting up against time. So I did want to leave a few minutes for questions. So to go to the last slide here. So one of the things that I wanted to say here is you're going to have to know what the other agencies want. You're going to have to know what your collaborating agencies do. You're going to have to understand what Social Security does, what the schools do, what your 501s do. We found time and time again, the lack of communication between case managers that is the crack through which people fall. That is without a doubt where things falter. And it's the problem area where these things take place. So Drea, let's go ahead and go to question one, because I want to have a chance for the policy stuff is almost identical to what we did. So I do want to have time for these questions. So Drea, if you'll go to the question one. Drea, I'm going to hand it over to you so we can get a little bit of questions in before we have to head out.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Williams. So we know that we just talked for almost an hour. There's a lot of information. You may have questions, but we wanted to present some to our audience and see if we could get a little feedback. So what aspects of the Promise participant and stakeholders accounts of what contributed to successful outcomes is in keeping with current understanding of case management best practices in VR service environments, and what isn't?
Anybody have any comments for that? That's what we wanted to get you to think about. Of all the stuff we presented, what is it that you're doing now? And is it something that could be a best practice with what you do?
client first services, like, and client involvement from beginning to the end, and even after when you go to that 1 week, or like when they're having problems, as long as the case management is involved around the client should be able to cultivate success. Sorry, I'm gonna shut up.
No, I think that's absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's where success comes from. Any other comments? Very good.
I
Go
got
ahead.
a personal anecdote. I know
Sure.
this is Adam White. I was a transition counselor during this time, and I was working a lot with Renisha Rivers, who was one of the the caseworkers for Promise, and we had a pretty good rapport, pretty good communication, and I think the cases that we shared due to the client herself and myself, we were able to effectively communicate kind of the needs of the client. And I felt like the ones that we were working on in tandem generally had a better successful outcome.
Yeah, and like I said, and it was knowing, like I said, and I don't want to. I understand time commitments. I am not so naive as to say that I'm not asking you to do extra. But to Adam's point, when your awareness of how how partnering agencies work, as Adam said, when you fill in those cracks, fewer people fall in them. I mean, is that fair to say, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, off the record, the ones that swam are the ones that were successful. The ones that effectively followed through, answered phone calls, and unfortunately, the ones that didn't answer phone calls or emails, it was hard to. And again, that may not be on the client. That's again maybe lack of resources. Maybe they didn't have a charger for their phone, or so even though the client may have not been involved, it may not been because of their own will, maybe due to outside variables like you mentioned earlier. And to be cognizant of that goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, at some point, I encourage everyone on this Zoom to buy me a beer and have me wax poetic on the issues of one strike and you're out. Social services have monumental tasks, and we're challenged with caseloads that are insurmountable. But I'm doing okay these days, and I walked off 2 or 3 different jobs during my youth that I said to heck with it. I'm not doing this crap, and I'm okay. And yet we often anticipate that people with disabilities, if they get fed up and don't like something or don't follow through, that their punishment is never to receive services again. And I think at some point we have to understand that autonomy is in of itself a bad thing.
Can I say something as a client?
Sure.
And someone going to school to be a counselor, like, you got to take responsibility and be stronger than your excuses. Like, I've had a feeding tube this year. I was here last year though, and ain't nothing stopping me. Like, you got to have that push through. Even though I am disabled, I am not handicapped. And, there are a lot of situations where I am handicapped and I'm crazy AF, but you know what? You got to keep on keeping on. And the counselors that I've had, they've always backed me up. I have a really great counselor right now. And I just got to say that that's kind of the relative stance from it. You know what I mean?
I think that's exactly right. Well, everyone, unfortunately, it's 10 o'clock. I'm going to allow my other presenters to answer remaining questions, but I have to hop off to go to another Zoom meeting. Thank you all for having us today.
I do notice that we have one other person who has their hand raised, but I do want to be respectful of the time. So Miranda, can you give us a little direction?
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We will be having the presenters' contact information available. So if you do have questions, please note those and we will make sure that we can get you their contact information. It is up on the screen right now. And we will also, I'm sure, be linking that at the end of the conference. So I think we will all be put back into the lobby area to get ready for the next proposal or presentation.
Thank you.
We do have a 15-minute break in between the sessions, so feel free to get up and stretch, have conversation. We may play some music again if there isn't a whole lot of conversation, but we are available for questions if you need anything.